Okay, welcome everybody to I think the final Sygnia webinar for the year. I'm hoping that you all have one eye on the holidays as I do, but let's just give this one last sort of push to the end of the year with hopefully some interesting information and data to take with you to think about and ruminate until next year. This is a slightly let's call it different webinar in that I'm trying to focus on a very particular sector, one that I think perhaps is very, very different to those that we are commonly associated with in terms of industry analysis and sectors, and I'll run you through that. So time is not on our side, and I know that people are streaming in quite steadily, but I'll keep going for those that have already joined us. So in terms of my focus, looking at the global pharmaceutical industry, I'm going to give you sort of, I guess, three big areas in the presentation. Will be just giving you a size and shape of global pharma, just give you a quick sense of what this industry looks like globally, market share and so on, and then actually give you a sense in the what I call the key determinants of growth and opportunity in global pharma, but actually give you a sense of why this is such an idiosyncratic sector. A little bit of a warning label is I'm not medically trained, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a pharmacist, but that has never stopped any economist before in diving in. And it is fascinating to me how different this industry is to others that I've seen, such as mining or agriculture and manufacturing and so on. Then the third big segment of the presentation will be around the who's who, which are the top 50 global pharma companies, but also which are the blockbuster drugs that are driving sales, to what extent is their key dependence on specific drugs, and so on. And then if there's time, I'll give you a little bit of an insight into stock picking if people are interested at all. So what does this industry look like? I always find that numbers are difficult to grab a hold of, right? But if I tell you the global pharmaceutical market is worth $1.48 trillion, that sounds like a big number. So give me a ratio, that's what I prefer. It's about 1% of global GDP, or even better, about the GDP in GDP terms, the size of Netherlands, right? So this is a sizable industry that represents, one of the key high-income countries in the EU in terms of GDP size. It's estimated also growing healthily, CAGR of about 5.7% to 2028. So over the next 5 years, you've got a healthy growth rate. What does it look like in terms of sales volume by country? Well, as always in many of these industries, the US is dominant, right? So the US remains the largest pharmaceutical market by sales volume. About 43% of all sales globally are accounted for by the US. China is second, but lags far behind. So China's in your green bar there, and China's only 8% of global sales. So the US is the dominant front runner, right, by country. One of the things and we'll talk a little bit about it as we go through the sort of industry's features and what are the drivers and so on. But if you look at your country spread, yes, mainly high-income countries in total global sales. But the underlying factor, of course, is epidemiological in many ways, right? So aging populations, the growth of what they call personalized medicine. So a lot of us are looking for personalized treatment. There's the rise of chronic diseases, many of which are driven by environmental factors and so on. And so all of that feeds into market growth that we classically think of in terms of, other products. But it's also good to look at quality of spend, right? And on the left, they've got the per capita expenditure on retail pharmaceuticals. But just before that, just think of it in terms of the labor market or the employment size. This is an industry globally that has the labor force the size of Switzerland. So there's another nice, if I give you 5.5 million, that seems like a lot, but that's the size of Switzerland, right? But the indirect job effect is significant, right? So you're looking at almost a multiple of 8 times in terms of indirect jobs across the entire global pharmaceutical supply chain, right? Many of which are, those jobs feed into or are directly linked into Asian markets. So you've got developing country supply chains that feed into the pharmaceutical industry. So let me just put my timer on so I don't keep you here for too long. But if you look at the quality of the pharmaceutical spend, right, that's a slightly different story to the US dominance, right? So what you start to see, for example, right, that the average US consumer is spending about $1,300 per capita per annum, so per year, on pharmaceuticals. And just notice the nuance here. So you've got a differentiation between prescription meds and over-the-counter stuff, right? Prescription meds still dominate, right? But it's mainly high-income countries, right? Germany, Canada, and Japan follow the US in terms of quality of spend, if you like, or level of spending. So in many ways, for the global pharmaceutical industry, they're looking at these markets as their target markets. I'll talk a little bit later about where that may be different depending on the product that's being sold. Interestingly, and I was surprised when I saw this, there are very, very few developing countries in the sample except for Mexico and Costa Rica, interestingly, right at the bottom, although I think the Costa Rica is a US bias, US immigrant kind of story. But in many cases, these consumers outside of the US are only spending about 60% of what the average US consumer is spending on both prescription and OTC drugs. So in many ways, the global pharmaceutical industries have to be US based. So what about trade? So if you look at global pharmaceutical trade, both exports and imports, slightly more nuanced. So the EU turns out to be, so Germany, Switzerland, Belgium in particular, and then you've got France as well, are key global exporters in pharmaceutical products, right? The US is there, but it's slightly more biased in terms of export profile towards the EU. They are key developing country exporters. So you've got India, China, Singapore that feature, well, Singapore, but I guess India and China are key as exporters as well. Japan, which I'll come to later in terms of its type of pharmaceutical companies, also important. But essentially, it's a 20 economy game. So 20 economies, if you're looking at trade in or certainly export profile in pharmaceuticals, 20 economies account for 90% of global pharmaceutical exports. The US remains, which would make sense given the previous slide, the key importer of pharmaceutical products, right? So more than 60% of all global pharmaceutical imports land in the US. And then you've got that play, which is if you look at this list here, if you look at my cursor, you can see it's mainly the EU, high-income countries, with China slowly coming through. Very little, except maybe for Saudi Arabia, a little bit of Poland and Brazil. Very, very little in terms of just values, right? Very little in terms of developing countries. But this is a very different industry, right? And it's a very different industry because of something called the drug life cycle, right? And I put this, it's a little bit blurry, but it's a fundamentally useful insight into why this is such a different industry. This is an industry that isn't about going into a factory and making a widget, right? And then trying to sell it and marketing it and so on. This is about discovery of compounds. They can be biological, they can be chemical, right? But the discovery of the new compound is what starts the drug life cycle process to get it to market, right? And you can see here on the left that you've got very clear and codified stages in actually getting a product to market or a drug to market, right, in this case. And firstly, there's the testing in the lab, or what they call animal models or preclinical testing. I'm sure you've seen that before. So where, you know, a drug is tested on rats and rabbits and so on, right? But that's a codified, regulated process. And this is sort of US-based, but it's similar around the world with a few tweaks. And the manufacturer, namely the Global Pharma company, has to submit what they call an INDA, right? A new investigational new drug application, right? To the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration. And if And only if that IND is granted can you then move from animals onto human testing. When you get to human testing, there are 3 phases, right? It's not a case of like you do it once and off you go, right? And the molecule or the new drug has to pass through every subsequent phase, which has, let's call it, upgraded levels of both testing and security in order to ensure that, you know, patients or subjects are not negatively affected by the drug. The drug then can go to market, right? But in that period to market, and we'll talk a little bit later about patents and patent protection and patent cliffs and so on, once it goes to market, right, that patent is granted, right, following approvals after phase 3, but the patent isn't obviously for a limitless period. And there is a patent expiration date. Usually it's 20 years in the US, and there's now what is called the Hatch-Waxman Act extension. So you can extend the patent for a couple of years beyond that. But essentially think of it as a 20 years plus a little bit of a residual as the patent protection period when the pharmaceuticals can market the drug, can sell the drug without any competitors. Not always true, and we'll come back to it. But once the patent ends, the generics enter into the market. And that's true for many. If you've been to a pharmacist, you know, they will always ask you, do you want the original or do you want the generic? And the generics are the ones that enter after the patent is expired, much lower, of course, testing of equivalence in terms of the components that make up the drug. And if they are successful in terms of the generics, it's called an ANDA is approved, and off they go in terms of marketing the generic. And so in many ways, this kind of drug life cycle is essentially the product life cycle that faces a pharmaceutical company, and it's the kind of choices they need to make in terms of maximizing revenue and sales of potential products that they bring to market. So moving on to what I've called the key determinants of growth, if you like, and profitability and opportunity for pharmaceutical companies. And I'll run through a few of these in a sort of broad way around pricing, patents, and marketing, and run through a few of the others. So if you look at patent protection, yes, it exists. It's legally granted, but it's never, right? And you will know from drugs, right? So if I've just put here, I'll come back to all of these, but I'll put here a list of the biggest new sales generators. Well, if you look at some of them, Ozempic and Wegovy, right? And I think it's Mounjaro, where there are 2 different pharmaceutical companies, but essentially they're treating the same thing. So the patent is granted, but it's very, very difficult to keep it completely secret. And it's not a perfect tool for pure IP protection. And so often this becomes not a sort of magic bullet in terms of protecting profits and revenue from a new drug. When you're looking at testing and trials, I should have said that's average of 8 years, right? So if you look at my previous graph, you can, I'm sure we'll share it after this, you can see that the timeline when you're going through testing and trials, it's not a year, right? COVID was exceptional, but it's essentially because of the pandemic, but it's essentially a sort of a decade's worth of going through testing and trials. And I'll come back to this, but again, your probability of success on average, 20 to 30% is actually high, and it depends even on the treatment area. And I'll show this later. You can, though, think of additional revenue streams, and that's called off-label use. So often what you find is if a drug is approved for a certain type of treatment, right, one type of cancer, it can, in principle, and this is mainly in the US, as I say, regulations may differ by country, you can use that particular medical treatment for off-label use. So you can move often between cancers, so kidney and melanoma, for example, types of cancers, you can move between them. As I said to you, US patents generally last for about 2 decades, so 20 years, and it's been used and passed through the courts in the form of something called the Hatch-Waxman Act in 1984, which then allows for some extensions to the 20-year patents. Once the patent is granted, it's about marketing. And what you find, particularly in the US, right, but in other EU countries as well, you'll see very, very strong emphasis on marketing to get the drug sales pumped up in the period that you have, which is effectively the window period is 20 years for blockbuster drugs in particular. And then you face, as I've said, this generic competition. So you've got a it's, as I said to you at the outset, it's such an idiosyncratic industry, because if you think about it, you've got governments that sit there as regulators, because they have to regulate, whether it's the phase testing for safety, right, in terms of patients and the population and so on, right? But they also serve as the major customer. So governments, on the one hand, are trying to protect patients, trying to regulate the industry, but they serve as, in many cases, a monopsonist, right? But they're serving as a monopsonist against the patent monopolies that they created in the first place. Very, very unusual. Even in private markets, you've got patent monopolies that create strong incentives for customers, and that's basically the insurance agencies to grow, medical aid companies, to grow large enough to exercise the countervailing market power against these large pharmaceutical gorillas in the industry, right? And so there's this interesting tension, right, about giving enough sort of bulk, as I'll talk later, to the large pharmaceuticals to give them the revenue base to actually invest in new drugs and innovation, while making sure that their market domination isn't worse in terms of pricing for customers. Marketing is key. I've got a graphic here on the left, which is marketing spend by types of drugs, some of which may be known to you, some of it's not. Certainly Ozempic is probably known to you, but Humira and others may be less known. But if you visited the US, you will see adverts for a lot of these drugs, very sensitive, carefully curated marketing adverts according to these drugs, mainly in the US. But in terms of the numbers, right, it's very, very high marketing spend relative to other industries, about 15 to 20% of sales. A large part of the marketing is actually not TV, social media, and so on. It's what is called detailing in the US, which is the old pharmacy agents going to visit doctors and specialists. And that's a very, very important part of what the FDA regulates. There's very clear rules around how long the visit can be, what you're allowed to say, what you aren't allowed to say, and so on. So in many ways, a very unusual industry, right? Because you've got a product that is regulated by the self-same client that purchases the product. So, right, for national health systems, government is both regulator and purchaser, right? The customer is not consuming baked beans, right? So the product they're consuming involves the life and potential death of customers, right? So the marketing side has to be subtle, but it has to be large enough to actually generate returns for the massive R&D spend that you've accounted for in the uncertain outcome of producing a blockbuster drug. Very, very different to what you see in other industries. Patents are key, as we see, and who dominates the patent landscape? We would expect the US, but notably, if you look at this from the World Intellectual Property Organization data that I found, you've got currently about 100,000 pharma patents out of a global total of about 3.5 million, right? So that makes the pharmaceutical industry about the 7th most patent-intensive industry from about 35 fields recorded by the Institute, right? So it's right up there. It's a top 10 in terms of being patent intensive. We often lose sight of it. That's why I like the focus on this industry, because we're always thinking of the fourth industrial revolution and technology and data science and so on. But there are these old industries that are actually very R&D and technology intensive as well. But the US is lagging behind China. China's a really interesting case here, because going from almost 0 patents, so 4, can you believe it? 4 patents in 1985, they now constitute about 29% of all global pharma patents. And that's higher than the US, which is only at about 14%. So China is leading the charge in terms of innovation in this space. R&D is key. So as we've indicated, if you want to get through those phases with a high probability of success to get a blockbuster drug to market, you better be spending sufficiently on research and development. And this is slightly old data from the US on the left, but still true that it's second, the pharmaceutical industry is second only to IT in terms of aggregate R&D spend. And you see here in this table, for example, the cost per employee is about $75,000 per worker in the pharmaceutical industry in terms of R&D spend, which is way, way above any of the other industries in this table, and certainly about 6 times more than the average for the US. That was slightly old data, but I think it's still true. Here's another comparator. It's a technology-intensive and capital-intensive industry, if we think of it in an economic sense, and that's because it accounts for 21% of all R&D spend, right, but only 3% of employment. So that's a very clear indicator of it being capital-intensive, right? It's a little bit like mining, as we've said, because of that R&D spend, if you like, through those phases, animal testing and so on, in that you're going underground with mining and there's a long lead time to actually getting product to market. I think it's far less uncertain than mining, and that's what makes it far, far more complex. If you look at global data, right, the data shows that the pharmaceutical industry invests about 40% of their gross value added in R&D, right? And that's true for Japan and the US, and I would suspect it's true for many early developing countries. We'll come back to some of those results. If you look at Switzerland and Belgium, for example, 30% of all R&D spend in those countries, 30%, right? So that's close to a third of all R&D spend in Switzerland and Belgium is accounted for by the pharmaceutical industry. So if you want a window into understanding these economies, you often think of Switzerland as watches and chocolates. I would say it's not really, actually. It's about the pharmaceutical industry. So if you think about market structure, if you're thinking about buyer power, I'll come to this a little bit later, but the market is dominated, right? It's really dominated by a clutch of these large multinationals, right? So Johnson & Johnson, Bayer, Novartis, Pfizer, who we know much better now because of COVID, but they dominate. And the approach really is through the sort of oligopoly, really, right? You use your financial muscle, your brand reputation, and your significant scale-wise R&D to grow market share and drive sales. And so that global presence across products gives you diversity and scale. But as I'll show later, it's surprisingly dependent on so there's surprisingly key risks in terms of drug sales, and I'll come to that a bit later. But because of the nature of this, remember that at its source, it's about innovation, right? So when you think of innovation, it does allow for smaller firms. So for example, in the biotech space, where you're using living organisms to make compounds and therefore take drugs to market, you can imagine how university-based institutes or clever scientists are able to generate sort of new products and take them to scale through a venture capital type approach. The key buyers, as we can see, so there's sort of a summary of what we've discussed, but hospitals, pharmacies, health insurance providers, government healthcare programs. So you've got strong buyer power, ease of market entry, and it's strongly affected by these legal and regulatory frameworks. That's absolutely key. And you'll find that as you move across countries, these regulations will change, right? And they will be tweaked. You cannot just open up a pharmaceutical. I think it seems obvious, but you can't just open up shop and start selling a drug, right? Even as you move from Pfizer takes a vaccine into a new country or a product into a new country, they have to abide by the country's regulations and governance procedures. And I think that's both an opportunity, but also something that they have to take care of, which makes it very, very different to other industries. For me, the two phrases you never see in any other sector at least from what I know, is blockbuster drugs and patent cliffs, right? Those are very specific to this industry. The blockbuster drugs are the ones that are going to drive your revenue, and I'll show you that later. So the search is on for all the big guys to actually get these blockbuster drugs, right? Whether it's Ozempic or Humira, those are the ones that they're after that are going to drive and run their sales for years to come. But they know they're on a race against time for a 20-year period. And so there's massive marketing spend because, and that's the second point, you will get to a patent cliff. And the patent cliff, simply put, is when the patent ends, right? And effectively, that's when the generics either enter or competitors can provide not necessarily generics, but have far easier access to provide alternatives that are similar and can be marketed at similar prices. But it's key to note that the patent cliff is not homogeneous, right? So some drugs are much harder to get an effective generic replacement for, and so that gives them a much longer runway. And so that's also something for farmers to consider. You've got two countervailing forces in developed countries, so that's another thing to keep in mind. So developed countries or high-income countries have got these aging populations, so there's these massive demand spikes, if you like, right, for all sorts of treatment regimes, whether it's skincare, whether it's ophthalmology, oncology, right? All of that is going to come in terms of an aging population, but that obviously demographically means rising healthcare costs, right? And so government will respond because it's the purchaser, right? In many of the national health systems, it's a key purchaser, will respond by fighting back on price increases, right? Emerging markets are growing potential, and I'll talk about this right at the end in terms of particularly non-communicable diseases. But you also have big buyers that sit embedded in countries, right? And either, if you know the US, you've got these big pharmaceutical chains, CVS, Walgreens, and then your national health services, right? Price sensitivity is a really, again, nobody is outraged, right, when the price of a diamond ring quadruples. There's no outrage because it's a diamond ring, right? There may be almost awe, right, at the rise in prices of diamond rings. But if you triple the price of cancer treatment for children, suddenly this becomes a very emotive, personal, ethical issue, right? And price sensitivity is very different in this sector to others, right? And you are seeing it in the US, whether it's a backlash against drug companies charging too much as it's viewed for treatment regimes. And there are many cases. I put one example here where a pharmaceutical company, Vertex, has therapies for cystic fibrosis, and they're charging $300,000 per patient, right? I suspect, I can't see any of you, if I told you this, you have an association in some form, directly, indirectly, to cystic fibrosis, this would seem unfair to you. But if I change that and I call it a diamond ring, it'll be very different. And I think that's the kind of tension that exists in this industry, very different to others. The supply chain involves what are called active pharmaceutical ingredients, API producers. A lot of them sit in emerging markets, right? But many in developed markets. So BASF, you've heard of, Bayer, DuPont are the key upstream providers in this industry, and they provide diluents, guidance, and so on, right? You do need specialized facilities here. So if you think of South Africa, is there an opportunity? But that's where you need highly skilled workers operating in very sterile environments, so that you can process biological materials under very specific conditions. Question, why don't pharmaceutical industries move up the value chain? And some of them have, right? So there's examples of Sanofi, one of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world, has actually moved upstream, and they're now going to launch what is called a new standalone business unit that's going to be an API producer for Europe. A lot of this was driven by supply chain bottlenecks, right, during COVID. So the idea that, you've got to get stuff from China or India in terms of API producers. That's going to disrupt supply chains and access to drugs. And so you are seeing this. So there's a different literature on nearshoring. So firms bringing production closer to home. So the US, for geopolitical reasons, taking production of microchips away from Taiwan, but asking the Taiwanese to relocate to the US or Mexico is the nearshoring example, and this is also true in APIs. Sometimes, importantly, pharmaceutical companies do outsource the drug testing and clinical trials to third-party test providers, some of which are in the HIV terrain, actually in South Africa. And so these are also important suppliers, these sort of external testing providers. But one of the key barriers to entry, right, is around the phases. So as I was digging through this, I was like, okay, but hang on, if you're going to go through 3 phases, what's your probability of success? That's the key question, right? And I found this excellent academic article, actually, which estimated the probability of success, right, by different therapeutic areas. And I think that's the key thing. And you can see it in the data here, right? So oncology is all the cancers, and you can run through the list here. But you can see overall your probability of success, right, as you run through the different phases is not great, right? So if you've got to take a risk probability approach to outcomes for drugs, you've got to be looking at historical experience across the treatment regimes and see what's your likelihood of maximizing revenue. So you've got a high, and again, this is mainly for the US, you've got a high of 33% in ophthalmology, right? So your probability of success, which is very, very low, for example, a low of 3.4% is the success rate for drug testing coming through all the clinical trial phases in oncology. That's very, very small, right? The highest you can get is in ophthalmology at 33% based on this data for the US. So that's a key consideration when you're trying to move into a particular area or you want to do drug development. You've got an eye on probability of success. Therefore, that means you need very high levels of scientific knowledge that's going to be objective enough to ensure that you've made the right bets. The patent protection story is not without its own drama. So you've got these like the blockbuster drugs that are making you huge amounts of money, right? And again, as I said, I'll show you some numbers, right? But that's your runway. That's the real juice in the system for many of the big pharmas. So what do you want to do? Well, there's nothing like using court systems, which is a lot of what the global pharmas do, is they use court systems to actually stall the onset of generics, and they keep competitors in the court while they carry on milking the patent period. And that's a very, very common strategy used by big pharma, and the fees can run into the millions, but that's nothing compared to the revenue that's generated from these blockbuster drugs. But the generics are always waiting, and there's some companies that actually specialize in generics. So you've got Teva, Sandoz from Novartis. They position themselves purely as a generics producer. So the generics, it's not a case of simply just waiting until the patent ends and then you flick the switch, right? It's expiry of patents are unclear, so you may then get this extended for a long period. The likelihood of or the difficulty of replication, right? So you have to be able to replicate, and nothing stops the existing patent holder from introducing their own generic, right? But under a similar name, right? So, and if you think of a little bit of brand loyalty, if you think of ourselves and Panado, we're not buying paracetamol XYZ, we rather buy Panado, right? That's the kind of brand loyalty that you can still get through as the original producer, and then keep the generics away from market for a while. Generics seem to plateau, at least based on historical evidence and cross-country evidence. There's some data from the OECD. and they tend to plateau at about sort of 10 to 20% of total volume or total value in terms of market share. But there's a strong push in most countries, particularly at the national health level, where countries are very explicitly trying to cut costs through the use by law, and that's the regulatory fiat of by law in terms of using generics. So if you look at the NHS in the UK, 81% of all drugs used in primary care are generic drugs, right? And that's purely for savings in terms of the country's health system. The Chinese have got a very interesting, I found this factoid where the Chinese actually released a list in June 2019 of the 34 drugs whose patents were going to expire, right? And that's almost a process of encouraging pharmaceutical companies to develop generics in advance of the patents expiring. So one thing you can do is, if the nimble, small, highly competitive venture capital, very smart university professors have found a new drug and they're onto something, is you go into M&A kind of territory. So that's what some of the big guys have done, right? So they engage quite healthily in M&A activity, going into specific areas. If there's a new drug that they see that's coming up, they will purchase the company. That then enters into which I don't get into, enters into the domain of regulatory oversight, and to what extent does government ensure that they keep this balance between market power and enough innovation. So as companies see patents expiring, they're increasingly motivated to acquire these smaller companies that have revenue potential in maybe neighborhood kind of treatment areas where they know some of the chemistry and the chemical compounding around the drugs. And you've seen examples, right? So you'll look through M&A activity. Pfizer, for example, at a very early stage of the company's clinical trials, acquired Arena Pharmaceuticals because they were very, very interested in the immunoinflammatory diseases that the company was developing. Okay, so that's sort of a broad overview of the industry, its idiosyncrasies, talking about patents, talking about blockbuster drugs, and so on. Now let's look at the supply side of this economy, right? So let's look at the companies themselves and ask the question, who lives in this space? So this is sort of a simple, total sales description of the big 50, as we call them, right? So Pfizer, Novartis, Roche, Merck and Company, and Sanofi are the top 5 of the largest global pharma as measured by sales, right? And that is in 2017. They sort of shift around, and I'll show you a little bit later how they shift around, but that's essentially the big gorillas in global pharma, right? And they account for, close to $500 billion of sales in 2017. You're looking at any kind of stock picking globally, right? For pharma, if this is something that you're interested in, these are the companies you need to be looking at. It's not clear though that sales are necessarily the best, of course, are the best measure. So if I take a simple cumulative distribution function of these sales, I come up with something I call the Elite 11. I just thought it sounded nicer than the top 10. And essentially you run through, you can see those, Pfizer, Novartis, Roche, Merck & Co, Sanofi, and then you've got Johnson & Johnson, Gilead, GlaxoSmithKline, AbbVie, and Amgen. And I'll show you how sensitive the bottom end in particular, so the 9, 10, 11 guys, how sensitive they are to drugs and competitors that come up with new drugs. Really interesting switch happening at the bottom because of new drugs. The one important thing is, in some cases, particularly in Johnson & Johnson, less so for the others, just remember that they're not totally and completely pharmaceutical companies. So Johnson & Johnson, as you know, will sell baby powder, deodorants, and so on. So you just want to keep an eye on what's a pure pharma as opposed to a broader health play in many ways. Country distribution, right? So again, if you want to get a sense of where these companies are located, right, there's an overwhelming, not surprisingly, US dominance in terms of the number of companies, right? So just by the pure company count, so that last column, 32% of the firms are American, 10% are Japanese, right? So just think of the sales volume, right? So these may not be large companies, but there's certainly a lot of them, right? And that would explain the Japanese dominance. So again, you may be looking at, if you really want to get into the micro details and the weeds of this industry, and I'll show you a graph later, if you're interested in niche operators that are smaller pharmaceutical companies, the Japanese may be a better bet in terms of that approach. 5% are German. The count doesn't help you when you look at the Swiss, because they only have 2 firms in the top 50, but they account for 13% of global sales. So it's important to keep both of that in mind. And most of them are headquartered into the OECD. So if I could sort of extend that a little bit, maybe some poetic license, is that on the supply side, you probably have a dominance towards the EU in terms of where the big pharmaceutical companies are located, producing and exporting from. And essentially, their dominant market on the demand for product side sits in the US. And that's sort of what it looks like. You don't really have major emerging market lists, but we have a reason to be South Africa proud, because Aspen makes the list. So right at the bottom there, that's Aspen, right? So a massive positive that we actually have Aspen as clearly the only African, but I think only one of a handful of developing country pharmaceutical companies in the top 50. One odd thing, maybe a data thing, is that China's not there. So I've taken the liberty of trying to give you more of a visual sense of who the big players are. So this is the same list, but just in a nice visual play. So if you're looking for our favorite South African one, it's Aspen is down there in the bottom right. But you see the dominance, right? Just in terms of the visual of the big sort of, let's call them the elite 11, right? So in excess of 41 billion of sales are accountable by Pfizer, Novartis, and Roche, right? And so that's really important to keep in mind, except just to remember that this is where companies are listed. These are the sales volumes, but the production of these pharmaceuticals, so the value chain, does not necessarily take place in the economy in which they're domiciled. I think that's pretty obvious to everybody on this call. So just keep that distinction in mind, right? So everybody sitting in Roche is not necessarily in Switzerland. We spoke about R&D spend, right? So R&D spend was an interesting, and I generated some of these graphs just to try and play around with the data that I got, right? And clearly you see R&D spend and sales. So how, can R&D generate the kind of sales? So you've got to make sure that you're spending as much as possible to generate the returns on sales. Yes, so it's broadly positively related, but to some extent it's endogenous, right? So that's a problem, I know, right? Because, the larger you are, the more you'll, larger you are, in other words, in terms of sales, the more you'll spend on R&D. And in fact, interestingly, a simple OLS regression shows that the coefficient's actually significant, but very small in size. So it's not clear that you get massive returns, and I'll talk to that a bit later, on average, from higher R&D spend. You get the usual suspects just because they're the larger firms, right? So you got Roche, you got Sanofi, you've got Novartis, you've got Pfizer, Merck and Co, you've got Johnson, right? So those are the standard guys that are there. But what about trying to take the denominator in a different way? What about, say, looking at the following, which is the ratio of R&D spend to sales within the company? So in other words, you're trying to get a measure here, not of scale, but of intensity, right? So in other words, you're trying to get a sense of the intensity of R&D spend within the company, right? And here the ranking does change. So suddenly, if you look at this list here, I don't think any of the three are known to, it certainly wasn't known to me. Any of these three companies are not known to us, right? Turns out, so just to be clear, as a proportion of your own intra-company sales, how much do you spend on R&D? And there you're starting to see far more R&D intensive firms as opposed to just based on scale. And so here's one example. Chugai, CSL, and Valiant, many of which are Japanese firms, right, are the top 3 R&D spenders, right? And I've got the full list in the appendix. Whereas Pfizer drops to 29, Roche 16, Novartis 23, right? So in many ways, don't confuse scale of R&D spend with R&D in intensity. It's possible R&D intensity is linked to drug type. So some of the sort of way out there innovative strategies that you have for drug innovation may be related to the drug type. So you may need to spend far more as a proportion of sales on R&D. It's also possible that for particular drugs, you are spending far less on marketing, right? So in other words, because it's a niche, and we'll talk about this later, maybe an orphan drug or something, you don't need to spend as much on marketing. And so that then increases the ratio, right? And of course, for large pharmas, you've got these massive OpEx spends and so on, which have to be allocated away from R&D. But it does suggest that, if you're starting to think about innovative companies in the space, that you may want to focus both on the intensity, so the intra-company measure, as well as scale. So getting onto the good old sort of lists of drugs that we like to focus on a lot in this space, or things that you've seen. This is just one example of 2018 data, and you can see Humira, which is an anti-inflammatory for arthritis and so on, is far and away. This was the blockbuster for AbbVie, right? So AbbVie, made an absolute sort of mountains of cash off one drug, right? Just to be clear, it's cyclical, right? So it's a little bit, I wouldn't exactly call it a sort of feast or famine kind of industry, but in the drugs you do see volatility, right? So you would have all remembered a few years back, Viagra was the talk of the town. So everybody was talking about that. Was the blockbuster drug then, right? COVID, of course, comes, and now currently we're living through a period where anybody and everybody's only talking about Ozempic, right? The weight loss drug, right? And so strong cyclicality is important in understanding drug revenue earnings, right? And that should feature when you're thinking of your sort of value ratios, when you're looking at stock picks or anything like that. There's also core disease trends, right? So the sudden obsession, well, maybe not sudden obsession, but we always knew that weight loss drugs were really key in the sort of adjacent markets. So it wasn't medicinal, right? It was lifestyle type stuff and diets and so on. And suddenly if you have a drug solution, right, that's going to pick up in terms of demand, and hence the Ozempic focus, right? But the other, and I'll talk to this about your mental model of what drives drug demand, there are other factors such as ongoing cancers and the focus on lifestyle diseases, right? And how those evolve in different countries and different regions. But there's a surprisingly high, and this is the point I was going to make earlier, right? So you got these blockbuster drugs, and so is there a dependence on them? And surprisingly high, right? So I took these figures and said, okay, well, give me the top 3 drugs revenue, and let me just calculate it as percentage of total sales. It's surprisingly large, right? So on average in the sample that I've got here, right, these are these top 50 companies, right? So let's be clear, the top 3 selling drugs account for over 41% of total sales. Just dwell on that, right? So if you're a company selling thousands of products, and it's your top 3 that account for close to half of your total sales, that sounds to me, does not sound to me like a diversified profile of portfolio of products, right? Even at the median, so maybe there's a bias on the tail of the distribution, even at the median is 37%, right? That is surprisingly high. And even if you take, let's just take AbbVie, which we've spoken about, Humira, so AbbVie, it's over 80%, right? Some of the big players, you can see here, where you see whether it's Biogen, whether it's Regeneron, you're looking at even Novo Nordisk, right? Very well-known big global pharma, it's close to 60% as a dependence of 3 drugs on total revenue. Roche, let's find Roche here. The number there is about over 50%. So surprisingly large key dependence on top 3 selling drugs. Turn the data in a different way, and you see very clearly that the return on R&D, so this is just the revenue from the top 3 selling drugs by the company. So let's look at the actual drugs and how much revenue they get, with the number here that's on top of each of the bars representing the share of the top 3 drugs revenue in total sales. So put differently, for Roche, the top 3 drugs accounted for 51% of all sales. For AbbVie, it was 83%, right? For Pfizer, it was 30%. And so you go down the list, right? And for me, that represents significant risk-return matrix insight into, you better make sure that your R&D spend gives you the kind of return that you want. I make the point here that irrespective of the quantum of revenue earned, right? So that means irrespective of the sale, the dependence on the 3 drug return is true for almost all companies except for a very, very small number that are almost irrelevant in the distribution, right? So we show, for example, in this data, 83% of companies rely on 3 drugs for more than 50% of their total sales. So if you turn that on its head, the other way to look at it, perhaps in a more positive light, is that the race is on to get 3 blockbuster drugs for most of the farmers. And that's where they end up. So if you look at your top 20 drug sellers, 2018, Humira, as we've mentioned, completely dominates the market, right? But you see here, right, that the big players get there. So I've tried to color code it, not perfectly, but Roche has got 3 in the top 10, right? Pfizer has got a few drugs. This is all pre-COVID. Bristol Myers Squibb has got a few, and so on. So as I said, the business model strongly reliant on finding that next blockbuster drug and maximizing revenue. So if you just wanted some flavor for the non-medically trained like me, Humira is for arthritis. You've got Stelara, which is for psoriasis. Keytruda, which will come up later, is for oncology. Herceptin is for breast cancer. Colon cancer is Avastin, and so on. And you can run through the list, but you can begin to see the underlying treatment regimes and areas for the drugs that are being sold. If there's a view, and we've had this discussion before within Sygnia, that this is the market now is about weight loss drugs, and I think one needs to be really careful about sort of placing too much weight purely on one treatment area. And so we go back to the data and we say, okay, well, let's look at a revenue by type of treatment or therapy area, right? And it's very clear that it's actually oncology, right? So revenue, in simple terms, is still driven by traditional diseases such as cancer and immunodeficiency kind of treatment areas, right? There will be some overlap, just to be clear, between COVID vaccine and general vaccines, right? But in essence, you do get a sense, and I'll show you later as well, that oncology is far and away the most important treatment area to look out for in terms of where the next blockbuster drugs is going to come from, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't have a surge in demand due to things such as obesity and other areas, right? Key is that non-communicable diseases make up 60% of all deaths in the world today. And I'll come to that right at the end, which is, if you're in the space thinking about where broadly are the areas, is it communicable diseases, which would be like HIV, sort of contact-based diseases, or is it NCDs? It's NCDs that make up the majority of all deaths. One does need to keep an eye on communicable diseases, because those tend to be developing country focused with large governments with large health budgets. And so you could find a niche for a pharmaceutical company that wants to target that kind of market, and that's principally in HIV/AIDS, malaria, and so on. So what about going to the pipeline? Because that's another way to look at it, and there is data on what the pipeline looks like, and it is released annually, which will tell you where the drugs are coming from and which are the areas that are dominant. So it's clear, and this is the bottom part of the area graph, the light blue. It's clear that in terms of actual numbers of products that are in the pipeline, right, and on their way to submission to phase 3, it's oncology that's still dominant, right? So you do see a steady increase in products coming to market through the phase, or going into phasing and testing. You see a steady increase and then a very clear leveling off during the COVID years. I suspect it'll pick up again, right? But oncology accounts for 38%, right, of the pipeline, and continues to grow. You see that CAGR, it's 10.5% over the last 5 years, and I suspect that'll stay the same. The fastest growing, though, is what is called ear and eye conditions, and you can look for it in the graph at your leisure. And that's essentially rare eye conditions and associated kind of conditions. Neurology has 11% of the pipeline, and there's a growth in products that's predicted with the modest decline, but that's true for all the others. Vaccines obviously are very, very high. So you see an idiosyncrasy again, or an unpredictability in terms of disease evolution, is nobody would have seen vaccines climb so high, and it's purely because of the pandemic. Gastrointestinal disorders, 7% of pipelines, of the pipeline, and growing at a 10% CAGR. So you can run through all of these and see the play across the disease areas for the pharmaceutical companies. Moving now to some of the projections to the future, both in terms of companies and drugs, starting out with sort of the forecast around prescription drug sales, forecast to grow at an average annual growth rate of 6.5%, right, over the next 5 years, based on the 2021 baseline. Drug price pressure is not going anywhere, right? So we know just from reading the newspapers, right, there's constant pressure from regulators, from governments, from the population, in terms of high drug prices that are related to big pharmacy sort of pricing. There's an important area around what are called orphan drugs. And those are rare diseases that essentially wouldn't require large marketing budgets, right, and R&D, large R&D spend, but not large marketing. And those are bespoken, think of it, drugs for a very small share of the population. And they remain a big focus for developers. I would argue that the reason they remain a big focus is because they may be high risk, but there's massively high return if you can pick those parts of the population that are very, very elite and high income, that will be willing to pay anything for these bespoken drugs. And I think you're seeing that being played out in some drug areas. So drugs based on biotechnology, we didn't touch on this because I'm not a chemist, so I don't want to get into territory I don't know, but that's using living organisms. And as you can expect, that kind of sort of different way of producing compounds for drugs has grown, and it will grow, right? And so the prediction is it'll account for 37% of total prescription and over-the-counter sales in 2026. And that's from 30% currently. And so the idea is that you're going to get massive runway through these biotech products, right? Whereas generics would seem to not level off, but remain a constant but not growing share of sales. So if you're thinking of, okay, well, should I get into a generics or should I get into biotech? So some of it's sort of let's call it a steady earner would be the generics, and biotechs would be a little bit more of an aggressive entry into the market if you think of investments in any way. So what about the actual global top 10? And I said earlier that this does change, right? And it changes if you think about the rhythm of this industry, because you've got these blockbuster drugs that are that drive overall revenue, right? The few, it does mean by extension, that companies can move in and out of the top 10, right? And so what you have, so as a prediction to 2028, which is the blue bar, right, that Roche is projected to come out in 2028 based on the numbers from pharmaceutical experts in the sector, based on their drugs and the types of drugs and so on, particularly in cancer. And you see the others, the antibody revolution around Herceptin and Avastin, they are projected to be the top global pharma company by 2028, right? The idea is that given the evolution of drugs towards these weight loss drugs, you've suddenly got the big players in this area, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly. I mean, that's essentially what you're seeing. Suddenly the blockbuster drugs around weight loss, the Ozempics and so on, are coming from, let's call it those that were out of the top 10, right? So Lilly's Mounjaro is the other one. And Novo Nordisk has got not just Ozempic, but there are a few variants that are coming out, and that's going to drive their sales. And I would argue, and in fact, in this review from other experts say that this is almost an underestimate of how fast these two, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, will actually grow. And it's possible that they would move even further up the ranking. What about drugs? So before we get too fixated on the weight loss drugs, which is, again, where everybody's focused, Mounjaro, Ozempic, and so on, it's actually very clear in both the current 2022 and projected trends that, in fact, it's going to be a cancer drug. So the cancer drug is from Merck & Co., Keytruda, is going to remain the top-selling drug into 2028, right? And you see there that the forecast doesn't even include a sort of sub-formulation of Keytruda, which will probably get through phase 3, and that's then going to complement the sales of Keytruda, right? Which is broad-based for a whole range of cancers. And if you want to look at the bottom here, you can see if these drugs mean nothing to you. I think the treatment areas would mean a lot to you. And you can see both cancers, diabetes, and to some extent lifestyle disease, and then HIV as dominating the treatment areas, if you like. So just to dwell on that, Ozempic and Mounjaro have constantly sort of beaten all analysts' revenue expectations. So the idea is, and I think that's true, that it understates the size of what they're calling the semaglutide franchise, right? A classic American phrase of these diabetes drugs, which are effectively now being used as weight loss drugs. So I think that's going to push them up, but I still think Keytruda, by all projections, will still remain the top-selling drug over the next 5 years. So the last sort of 5 or 6 slides, and then I'll stop, and maybe if there's time, we'll take maybe a few questions. If you look at where, and there's sort of some evaluation that's placed on drugs that are in phase 3, so you can see potential revenue coming through, and then you obviously go back and link it to particular companies. You can see most of these late stage assets are owned by the large developers, right? And generally tend to be sort of a mixture of cancer, the obesity, Alzheimer's, and sort of mental health illness, right? You'd expect that in some of the smaller plays like Karuna, right? You expect to see that some of the smaller players, you'd expect to see them becoming an acquisition target, right? So you can sort of see some of the sort of trends in this kind of data. What are the projections in terms of therapy areas, right? So oncology is way out there, right? So sales are still going to be the highest in the cancer areas with very high growth rates, right? And this dominance is pre-existing, and it's continued to remain, right? So you've got a projection to grow for oncology up from 6 percentage points from 2022 to 2028, right? And that's more than double the sales that you see in any other in the second largest compared to the second largest drug sales therapy area by drug sales. You've got central nervous system market share and sales, which are also fairly dominant, right? And that covers both neurological and psychiatric conditions, and that's another growth area. It's going to expand. That's the projection. And you see the link to the regulatory story. So there's just projections for the US and area is that if the reimbursements from the healthcare providers improves for Alzheimer's, this projection for the central nervous system treatment area would be a lower bound, right? So you see how regulation can affect your projections. Immunomodulators are not very high in terms of sales, but they're going to be growing very, very fast. And I think that's the sort of autoimmune diseases, autoinflammatory diseases. And I've given some of the sort of the meds that are related, right? Big patent expiration. So if you're asking, well, endocrine, why is it so low? It's because patent cliffs are coming. And again, you've got to sort of understand the interactions between the drugs, patent cliffs, and revenue streams. So 3 more slides, literally. The mental model for me, I spoke about earlier about how to think about diseases, is a little bit like thinking about global demand across income areas. And if you look at this, which is true, it's actually drawn off a WHO piece, which is you're going to go where demand is and looking at appropriate price points and the ability to innovate, right? So that's the interaction. But if you look at this graphic here, non-communicable diseases are going to grow in every part of the world. Low-income countries, lower middle income, upper middle income, and actually just tapering off and remaining really, really high in high-income countries, right? So to be very clear, deaths from non-communicable diseases will actually grow from 60% to 74% of world mortality rates, right? So think of it this way, 3 out of 4 deaths in the world, right, over the next decade will come from non-communicable diseases, which is basically everything outside of sort of HIV, AIDS, COVID, and malaria, which is a massive market, right? And so the extent to which Global Pharma is looking at the evolution of diseases and the evolution of NCDs across countries at appropriate price points is an important one for companies that are very, very dependent on 2 or 3 blockbuster drugs. And the other side that they've got to be looking at is diversifying in terms of regional footprint. So last 2 slides, I'm not a stock picker by any means, but if you wanted to think about investing, what are the key financials from the US market? What's interesting is pharma did not outperform the US market in terms of the 5-year average, in terms of 3 years, but does, and in terms of 1 year, but does outperform healthcare as a whole. So healthcare as a whole, you separate out pharma, it does fairly well, and much, much better than overall healthcare, right? But again, it depends on the data used and the benchmark, and you just need to be a little bit more careful. But in general, as a starting point, I would argue if you look at the US market, which incidentally includes all FANG stocks, so even if you remove them, I think pharma has done better than let's call it non-FANG US market stock price trends. Final one, and I'll stop there. Even when you compare against the S&P numbers and the S&P 1/500 benchmark versus the S&P's own pharmaceutical index, the performance is less positive in absolute and relative terms, right? So on average, total returns for the pharma index was 8.6%, and if you're in S&P 1/500, you'd get 13.6%. Again, as I say, that's a tech-heavy stock price return, but it is what it is. Okay, I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions, but hopefully that was of some use in just thinking through a very, what I call, a different industry to traditional sectors that we're used to. So I'm going to look at so there's a very interesting question about India and China not featuring in the world pharma market by sales. I mean, I think that's a really, really good question. It's something that struck me that despite their population size, not markets. China could be a data issue, so that's not picked up in the numbers, but I think a lot of it is to do with the price points for the big blockbuster drugs. If you think of the cancer drugs, if you think of ophthalmology and so on, these are not drugs for the poor, right? Or drugs for developing countries. And so, yes, there may be market opportunities, but I think only as these economies grow, which I guess was my point in that slide about changing NCD numbers, right? So mortality from NCDs. Have there been new entrants into the top 50 since the COVID-19? No. So we haven't. So in terms of the top 50 global pharma, those are pretty much remain consistent. What's happened with the vaccine is you needed scale, you needed government access, and the government access, particularly on the US and the EU side, was to go to the big gorillas in this area and then ask them to develop. So there's one comment here about the biggest obstacle to the sector is institutional and government intervention, which they will justify on moral and ethical reasons. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the interplay, right? So to what extent, if you look at, so there are, for example, class action suits as we speak in the US around the negative effects from one of the diet loss drugs. I forget which one. It may be Ozempic, it may be one of the others in the US. And there's a very clear case where patients need to be protected, right, from the negative effects of health effects from a drug that's supposed to help you. And so you can see the importance of regulatory oversight. So it's this balance, right, in terms of protecting the consumer and also allowing pharmaceutical companies to innovate without fear of legal reprisal. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if there are any other questions. If there aren't any other questions. Oh, wait, I see one more, and then I think so do pharma price drugs vary, I think it is, differently in high income versus low income countries? How much discount might we get in South Africa relative to I think it depends on so if you're looking at price differences across countries, a lot of it is random. So you'd probably find it is to do with the both import surcharges and taxes in that country. It would be to do with the shortage of the drug in the country, given needs, the size of the population, and so on. So I think it's going to be random, but I don't think it's true that everywhere and always it's cheaper in the US or cheaper in South Africa. I think it is dependent on the particular drug. So as an example, if you wanted some of the weight loss drugs, they'd be much more expensive in the US, say, relative to South Africa, but they're in much more shortage in South Africa, actually. So, yeah. So I don't think there's a clear link to be made. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I want to thank you all. And even though I can't see you, thank you for joining. And I hope you all have a wonderful break. Take a good break and see you all in the new year, when I think we'll continue with the Sygnia webinar series. Thanks very much, everybody. Bye.